24 hours earlier, the biggest wedding Seoul had seen in a decade was still just a rumor whispered between rival families. By sunset, it was real. Cars lined the private estate for half a mile. Bodyguards in black suits stood at every entrance, earpieces glowing faintly, eyes scanning every guest twice before letting them through the gate. Carl stood at the altar in a tailored black tuxedo, hands clasped in front of him, jaw set in the same unreadable expression that had made grown men tremble in boardrooms and back alleys alike. He was the son of one of the most feared men in the country, heir to an empire built on fear, and yet here, waiting for his bride to appear, something in his chest felt unfamiliar. Soft, almost frightening in a way none of his enemies had ever managed to be. Then the doors opened. Aisha walked in wearing white, her dress catching the golden light pouring through the tall windows, and for the first time in years, Carl forgot to keep his face still. He smiled. A real one. The kind his own men had never seen. "You look like you're about to run," he murmured when she reached him, teasing, trying to coax the tension out of her shoulders. "I'm just nervous," she whispered back, and it wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth either. Because across the room, seated in the front row like a king surveying his kingdom, sat Carl's father, and every time his eyes drifted toward Aisha, her spine went rigid, her smile went brittle, and her hands found each other and gripped tight enough to whiten her knuckles. Nobody else seemed to notice. Why would they? To the room, he was simply the proud father of the groom, dabbing at his eyes with a silk handkerchief, radiating warmth and pride. But Aisha's whole body remembered him differently. The ceremony went on. Vows were exchanged. Rings were slid onto fingers with trembling hands. The room erupted into applause, camera flashes, congratulations shouted from every corner. And through it all, Carl kept glancing at his bride, a beat too long, studying her face the way he studied a room, before deciding whether it was safe to enter. He noticed the flinch when his father approached to offer his blessing. He noticed how she angled her body so there was always a person, a chair, a waiter with a tray of champagne, standing between herself and him. He noticed, and filed it away, the way he filed away everything, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment it would make sense. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt like something was wrong but couldn't explain why, stay close. Because Aisha couldn't explain it either. Not yet. The reception stretched into the night. Music, laughter, toasts from men whose hands had done things no toast could ever wash clean. Carl finally managed to pull his bride away from the crowd, out onto a private balcony, where the noise dimmed to a low hum beneath them. "You didn't eat anything," he said, nodding toward the untouched plate a waiter had brought earlier. "Not at the dinner. Not now. I wasn't hungry. Aisha." He said her name like it meant something, like it was the only word in any language he cared to get right. "I've spent my whole life reading people. It's the only reason I'm still alive. And I'm reading you right now, and something isn't adding up." She looked out over the city lights instead of at him. "Can we just have tonight? Just one night, where nothing has to add up?" He studied her for a long moment, then let it go, for now, and wrapped his jacket around her shoulders instead. "One night," he agreed. "Then tomorrow, you tell me everything." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Tomorrow felt very far away, and also terrifyingly close. Subscribe now if you want to see how far Carl will go once he finds out the truth. Because trust me, this is only the beginning. Later, alone in their private quarters, away from cameras and guests and watching eyes, Carl noticed something else. A crescent-shaped scar just above her collarbone, half hidden beneath her hair. His fingers hovered over it, and this time, she didn't pull away fast enough. "An old accident," she said quickly. "Which kind of accident leaves a scar shaped like that?" She didn't answer. He didn't push, not that night. Instead, he pulled her closer, tucked her head beneath his chin, and said the words that would haunt him later, once he understood exactly how wrong they were. "You'll never have to fear anything again. Not while you're my wife. Not while I'm breathing." She closed her eyes and let herself believe it, just for a moment, even though every instinct in her body screamed that the person she feared most was sleeping under the same roof, 3 doors down the hall. The next morning came fast. Golden light spilled across the bedroom, and Carl woke to find the space beside him empty. He found Aisha in the adjoining bathroom, changing out of her robe, And that was when he saw it in full daylight for the first time. Bruises along her ribs, deep purple fading to sickly green at the edges, layered over each other, like they'd been reopened again and again over the years. His stomach dropped. Aisha. His voice cracked in a way it never did. Who did this to you? She froze, robe half pulled around her, caught completely off guard. It's nothing. I fell. Don't. One word, sharp enough to cut through her excuse before it finished forming. Don't lie to me. Not today. Not ever. Silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Then, slowly, her shoulders sank, like a wall inside her had finally given out. She walked to her bag, pulled out the same worn photograph from the night before, and this time, she told him where it came from. Your father, she whispered. He's the reason I have these. All of them. Carl felt something shift in his chest, cold and final, like a door slamming somewhere deep inside him that could never be opened the same way again. If you thought last night's hook was intense, wait until you see what Carl does next. Hit subscribe, because part 2 of this story is coming, and you do not want to miss it. He looked at the photograph in his hands. His father, younger, standing over a family Carl had never seen before, his expression carved from the same cold pride Carl had grown up admiring. Tell me everything, he said quietly. Every single thing he did to you. I don't care how ugly it is. I need to know. And for the first time since the wedding began, Aisha finally believed someone might actually be on her side. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, pulling the robe tighter around herself, like it could shield her from the memory as much as the cold. It started when I was 19, she said. My parents owned land. Not much, but it was everything to them. 3 generations of it. Passed down, worked by hand. Then your father decided he wanted it. For what? Does it matter? A resort. A shipping route. I don't even think he needed it. I think he just wanted it because my father said no to him once, and no one says no to your father. Carl's hands curled into fists at his sides, though his voice stayed level, controlled, the way he'd trained himself to sound, even when everything underneath was on fire. Go on. He came to our house himself. That should have told us something. A man like him doesn't do his own dirty work unless he wants you to remember his face. He offered my father money. An insult, really, for land worth 10 times as much. My father refused. 2 weeks later, our accounts were frozen. A month after that, men came in the night. Her voice thinned out, and Carl reached for her hand without thinking, holding it like it was the only solid thing left in the room. They didn't just take the land, she continued. They wanted us to sign it over willingly, so there'd be no lawsuit, no scandal. And when my father still refused, they brought me into it. I was the leverage. I still have nightmares about that basement. But wait, here's where it gets worse. Because Carl was about to learn something that would make him question every story he'd ever been told about his own bloodline. He forged the papers eventually, Aisha said quietly, made it look legal. My family lost everything, and I lost 3 years of my life to hospitals and silence, because no one believed a poor family could accuse a man that powerful and survive it. Carl exhaled slowly, like he was trying to keep himself from shattering something in the room with his bare hands. And you married into his family anyway. I didn't know you were his son. Not until it was too late to walk away without both of us paying for it. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Grief, fury, disbelief, all tangled together, and refusing to separate. You should have told me before the wedding. Would you have believed me? Against your own father, on our wedding day, with no proof but an old photograph? He didn't answer right away, because the honest answer terrified him. A week ago, no. A week ago, he would have called it a lie, a manipulation, an attempt to weaken the empire he was born to inherit. But sitting here now, watching her hands shake as she spoke, he knew there was no version of this where she was the one lying. I believe you now, he finally said. And I promise you, Aisha, whatever it costs me, I am going to find out exactly how far this goes. She wanted to warn him. Wanted to tell him that his father didn't lose, ever, and that digging into this would put targets on both their backs. But some small, desperate part of her let herself hope, just this once, that maybe this time would be different. She had no idea just how different it was about to get. 3 days after the wedding, a folded note arrived at the estate, with no return address and no signature, slipped beneath Aisha's door, sometime between midnight and dawn. She recognized the handwriting instantly, even after all these years, because trauma has a way of burning certain things into memory forever. Come alone, tonight. Tell no one, especially not my son. Her hands shook as she read it. She thought about showing Carl immediately, about breaking the promise she'd made to herself the moment she agreed to marry into this family, the promise that she would never again let that man corner her without a witness. But beneath the note was something else. A photograph. Her mother, older now, standing outside a small apartment building Aisha didn't recognize, clearly taken without her mother's knowledge. A threat, disguised as an invitation. She knew then that refusing wasn't a real option. Whatever this was, it was bigger than her own safety. That evening, she told Carl she needed air, that the estate felt suffocating after days of wedding chaos, and he, still gentle with her in a way that made the lie taste like acid in her mouth, kissed her forehead and told her to take one of the cars, to call if she needed anything. She didn't take a car. She walked 3 blocks, hailed a taxi under a different name, and gave the driver an address she'd sworn she would never see again. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Stay with me. The mansion looked exactly as she remembered it. Wrought iron gates, gravel drive, security cameras disguised as garden ornaments. A butler let her in without a word, like he'd been expecting her for hours, and led her down a long hallway lined with portraits of ancestors who had built an empire on other people's suffering. Carl's father was waiting in the study, seated in a leather chair by the fire, a glass of amber liquid resting untouched in his hand. He didn't stand when she entered. He simply smiled, the same predatory smile she remembered from years ago, warm on the surface, ice underneath. Sit, he said, not a request. She stayed standing. Say what you called me here to say. Still so much fire in you. He took a slow sip from his glass. I always admired that about your family, even as I destroyed it. Why am I here? He set the glass down with a soft, deliberate click. Because I want to be very clear about something, since apparently my son's wedding vows have made you forget your place. I didn't approve this marriage because I forgave your family. I approved it because refusing would have caused more questions than I was willing to answer. That does not mean the past is settled. The land is legally. The land, he interrupted, voice sharpening for the first time, was never legally anything except mine. Your father signed papers he was too broken to read clearly. I made sure of that. Aisha's stomach turned. There it was. Confirmation, spoken from his own mouth, of everything she'd only ever been able to prove through scars and silence. But wait, because his next move was one she never saw coming. He rose from the chair, crossed the room slowly, deliberately, the way a predator closes distance on something it's already decided to catch. You will not tell my son anything more than you already have. You will smile at galas. You will give him children to secure the bloodline. And you will remember exactly what happens to families who cross mine. I already told him about the land, she said, chin lifted, despite the fear crawling up her spine. About what you did. Something in his expression cracked, just for a moment, cold fury flashing through the practiced warmth. You did what? Before she could answer, his hand moved faster than she expected, and the slap connected before she even registered the motion, snapping her head sideways, the sound of it swallowed by the thick curtains and soundproofed walls of a room built specifically for conversations no one else was meant to hear. She stumbled back into the wall, hand pressed to her burning cheek, and he was already calling for the guard stationed just outside the door. If you're new here, hit subscribe now, because you are not ready for what happens in the next 60 seconds. 2 men entered without hesitation, without question, like this was routine, like they'd done this before. Aisha didn't fight. She'd learned years ago that fighting only made it worse. She simply braced herself and let the blows land where they always landed, places that could be hidden beneath sleeves and long dresses, and carefully practiced smiles. Through the haze of pain, she heard his voice above her, calm again, terrifyingly calm. Tell my son nothing else, or the next visit won't be to you. It'll be to your mother, and I promise you she will not walk away from it. The guards released her. She pulled herself upright, blood on her lip, ribs screaming with every breath, and looked her father-in-law directly in the eyes, one final time before leaving. He already knows more than you think, she said quietly. And when he finds out the rest, No amount of money or fear is going to save you. She didn't wait for his response. She walked out with as much dignity as her battered body could manage, climbed into a taxi 3 streets away, and cried the entire ride home, silent, careful not to let the driver see. By the time she reached the estate, the sun was already threatening to rise. She slipped in through a side entrance, avoided the hallway cameras she knew Carl's security team monitored less carefully, and locked herself in the guest bathroom to assess the damage in the mirror. New bruises layered over the fading ones Carl had already discovered. A split lip she'd have to explain somehow. Ribs that made every breath feel like fire. She told herself she'd hide it, just one more day, until she figured out how to protect her mother without endangering Carl's trust in her. But some secrets have a way of surfacing no matter how carefully you bury them, and hers was about to surface in the worst possible way. Comment where you're watching from if you felt that slap in your chest, because we are just getting started. Morning came anyway, indifferent to what had happened in the dark. Aisha covered the split lip with careful makeup, wrapped a silk scarf loosely around her neck to hide the worst of the bruising along her collarbone, and practiced her smile in the mirror until it looked almost believable. Carl found her in the kitchen, already dressed, already composed, pouring coffee like the last 12 hours hadn't happened. "You look tired," he said, studying her the way he studied everything, too closely, too carefully. "I didn't sleep well. Where did you go last night?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and she felt the ripples of it spread through her chest. "I told you. I needed air. The car log shows you never used the vehicle." His voice stayed gentle, but there was steel underneath it now, the kind that had made captains twice his age fall silent in meetings. "I checked. Aisha, I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need you to tell me the truth." She set the coffee cup down, hands trembling badly enough that the porcelain rattled against the counter. Every instinct told her to lie again, to protect him from a truth that could tear his family apart from the inside, to protect her mother from a threat that felt very, very real after last night. But she was so tired of lying. "I went to see your father," she admitted quietly. Carl went completely still, the way he did right before something dangerous happened, the calm that his enemies had learned to fear more than his anger. Why? It wasn't a question anymore. It was a demand. She reached up and slowly unwrapped the scarf from her neck, revealing the deep purple bruising blooming across her collarbone, fresh enough that it hadn't even begun to fade yet. Carl's face drained of color. "He told me to stay silent," she whispered. "He told me if I said anything else to you, he'd go after my mother next." For a long moment, Carl said nothing at all. He simply stared at the bruises, jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along the side of his face, hands curling into fists at his sides, like he was fighting the urge to put them through the nearest wall. "He put his hands on you," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper, "in his own house, after I promised you nothing would ever hurt you again. Carl, I need you to stay here," he said suddenly, already turning toward the door, already reaching for his jacket. "Don't leave the estate. Don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize. I need to think." "Where are you going?" He paused at the doorway, and when he looked back at her, something in his eyes had changed completely. The softness she'd fallen for was still there, buried underneath, but something colder and far more dangerous had risen up alongside it. "To find out exactly how deep this goes," he said. "Every lie, every cover-up, every person who's ever helped him bury the truth. I'm going to find all of it." She wanted to warn him again, wanted to tell him how many people his father had silenced over the years, how thoroughly he'd learned to erase his own tracks. But watching Carl walk out that door, she realized something had shifted permanently between father and son, and there was no version of this story where things went back to how they used to be. Meanwhile, across the city, Carl sat in his office long after midnight, staring at security footage from the front gate. A single camera, angled just right, had caught his wife slipping out on foot instead of taking the car she'd claimed she would use. He rewound it 3 times, just to be sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Something was very wrong. And for the first time since childhood, Carl found himself questioning the one man he'd spent his entire life trusting without hesitation, his own father. Carl didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office with the lights off, laptop screen the only glow in the room, scrolling through years of family financial records he'd never bothered to question before. Growing up, He'd been taught that questioning his father was the same as questioning the empire itself, and questioning the empire was the same as betraying everything they'd built together. But bruises didn't lie, not the way people did. By sunrise, he'd made a list, 3 names. People who had worked closely enough with his father over the years to know things that never made it into official records. A retired family lawyer, a hospital administrator who'd handled a mysterious case years ago, and an old bodyguard who'd quietly left the organization not long after Aisha's family lost everything. He started with the lawyer. Minister Cho had aged considerably since Carl last saw him. Silver hair thinning, hands trembling slightly around his teacup as Carl sat across from him in a modest apartment far removed from the luxury Carl had grown up surrounded by. "I wondered when someone would finally ask," the old man said quietly, before Carl had even explained why he'd come. "Ask what?" Cho set his teacup down with a soft clink, staring at some point in the distance like he was seeing the past instead of the present. "About the land dispute. The Bankole family, wasn't it? I drafted papers for your father back then. I've regretted it every day since." Carl's pulse quickened. "What papers?" "Transfer of ownership documents. Except the signatures on the final copies weren't the ones I witnessed. Someone altered them after I left the room." Cho's voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. "I was young, ambitious. I told myself it wasn't my business how a client acquired what he already believed belonged to him. If you thought this story couldn't get more twisted, buckle up, because it's about to." "Do you still have copies?" Carl asked, leaning forward. Cho's eyes flickered with something like fear, but also relief. The specific relief of a man finally allowed to set down a weight he'd carried for far too long. "I kept everything, in case someone ever asked. I suppose I always knew someone eventually would." He disappeared into a back room and returned with a thick folder, yellowed at the edges, and placed it directly into Carl's hands, like he was passing along a bomb he'd been diffusing in slow motion for over a decade. Inside were the original documents, signatures that didn't match the forged versions filed with the government. Bank records showing money moved through shell companies to pay off officials who'd approved the fraudulent transfer. Photographs, actual photographs, of the Bankole family's original deed, dated years before Carl's father claimed ownership. Carl's hands shook as he flipped through page after page of proof. "Why keep this if you were afraid of him?" Carl asked. Cho smiled sadly. "Because guilt is heavier than fear, in the end. I just needed someone brave enough, or angry enough, to finally come asking." The hospital administrator told a similar story, though this one was harder for Carl to hear. Records confirmed a young woman had been admitted years ago under a false name, injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. Discharged early after an unusually large anonymous donation was made to the hospital's private wing. "We were told not to ask questions," the administrator admitted. "The donation covered a lot of silence. If you've made it this far, you already know this is bigger than one bad man. Comment below if you're starting to see the whole picture, because Carl was only getting started." The old bodyguard was the hardest to find, living quietly in a fishing village 3 hours outside the city, having cut all ties to the organization years ago. He didn't want to talk at first. Carl had to sit across from him for nearly an hour before the man finally opened up, staring out at the water instead of at Carl the entire time. "Your father is not the man you think he is," the bodyguard finally said. "I watched him do things to that family that I still see in my nightmares. I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore. I should have left sooner." "Why didn't you ever come forward?" The old man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Come forward to who? Your father owns half the officials in this country. I have a family. I chose to protect them by staying silent, the same way everyone else did." But he gave Carl something the others hadn't, a name. A witness who had actually seen the night Aisha's family was forced into the basement. Someone who could testify to exactly what had happened. Someone still alive and still willing, after all these years, to finally tell the truth. Carl left the fishing village with the folder from Cho tucked safely inside his jacket, a recorded statement from the hospital administrator saved on his phone, and a new name burning in his mind, feeling like the ground beneath his entire life had just been proven to be built on a foundation of lies. Wait until you see what happens when he brings all of this back to his own family. This is where the story goes from painful to explosive. That night, Carl spread everything across his desk, piece by piece, building a timeline that painted a picture far darker than even Aisha had described. His father hadn't just wanted the land. He'd wanted to make an example out of anyone who dared refuse him, and the Bankole family had simply been unlucky enough to be the lesson. He thought about his childhood, the stories his father told him about building the empire from nothing, about loyalty, about strength. He'd believed every word, had modeled his entire life around becoming a man his father would be proud of. Now he understood that pride had been built on someone else's suffering. Aisha found him there past midnight, still staring at the documents, and quietly sat down across from him without a word, giving him the space to process what he'd found. "It's worse than what you told me," he finally said, voice hollow. "He didn't just steal your land. He orchestrated the entire collapse of your family, methodically, over years, and then covered every trace of it so thoroughly that even I never questioned it." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't apologize to me." He looked up at her, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and fury both. "You spent years surviving what my own father did to you, while I grew up thinking he was the greatest man I'd ever known. I'm the one who should be apologizing." She reached across the desk and took his hand, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just sat together in the wreckage of everything Carl had believed about his own family. "What happens now?" she finally asked. Carl looked down at the folder, at the proof that could unravel everything his father had spent decades building, and felt something settle inside him, not anger anymore, but resolve, cold and absolute. "Now," he said quietly, "I take everything he built with fear, and I burn it down using the truth." Aisha's grip on his hand tightened, and something in her expression shifted from relief into worry. "Carl, listen to me. Before you do anything else, I need you to really think about what this means. He's your father. He raised you. He built this empire so you'd inherit it. Are you prepared for what it actually costs to take all of that away from him?" Carl was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the documents scattered across his desk, like pieces of a bomb he hadn't finished assembling. "He tortured your family. He hit you in his own home. He threatened your mother's life to keep you silent. What exactly am I supposed to weigh against that?" "I'm not saying protect him," she said gently. "I'm saying protect yourself. Whatever you're feeling right now, betrayal, anger, grief, it's going to make you want to move fast, and men like your father don't lose by accident. He'll see you coming before you're ready, unless you're careful. So what do you want me to do? Let it go?" "No." She shook her head firmly. "I want you to be smarter than he is. Gather everything. Build a case so airtight he can't buy his way out of it, or spin it into a lie. And Carl," she hesitated, searching his face carefully, "whatever happens, don't choose me over your family completely. Find a way to expose the truth without destroying every good thing that's left in your life. You'll regret it if there's nothing left of him to save." The words landed heavier than she expected, and Carl looked at her like she'd just handed him an impossible puzzle wrapped inside an olive branch he didn't know if he deserved to accept. "There might not be anything good left to save," he said quietly. "Not after tonight." He had no idea just how hard his father was about to fight back. The private study hadn't changed in 20 years. Same mahogany desk, same wall of photographs chronicling 4 decades of an empire built in shadow. Same oil painting of Carl's grandfather glaring down from above the fireplace like he was still supervising every decision made beneath his portrait. Carl waited until his father left for a late meeting across town, until the household staff finished their rounds and retreated to their quarters for the night, until the estate settled into the particular silence that only exists in houses built to keep secrets. Then he let himself into the study alone. His hands moved carefully behind the painting, searching for the mechanism Sue had described, and found it exactly where the old bodyguard said it would be. A small recessed panel, disguised as part of the wall's molding. The safe behind it required a code Carl didn't have. But Carl had grown up in this house. He knew his father better than anyone alive, and men like his father never chose codes randomly. They chose dates that mattered, dates that fed their pride. He tried his father's birthday first. Nothing. He tried the founding date of the family business. Nothing. Then, almost as an afterthought, he tried the date the land transfer papers were signed, a date burned into his memory now after everything he'd learned over the past week. The lock clicked open. If you thought this story couldn't get more intense, wait until you see what was actually inside that safe. Inside, wrapped in aging plastic to protect it from moisture, sat the original deed. Aisha's family's true, unforged signature, clearly visible at the bottom, dated years before the fraudulent version his father had used to justify the seizure. Beneath it sat a folder of financial records, bribery payments to officials, threats documented in his father's own handwriting for reasons Carl couldn't begin to understand, unless some twisted part of him had wanted proof of his own power preserved forever. Carl photographed everything, page by page, hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. Then he placed the original documents back exactly as he'd found them, closed the safe, and stepped back to consider his grandfather's painting, staring down at him with painted eyes that suddenly felt like judgment. He thought about the man who raised him, who taught him to walk into a room and command it without raising his voice, who sat beside his hospital bed for 3 straight nights when Carl nearly died from a rival family's attack as a teenager, who had, in his own broken way, loved him fiercely his entire life. Could he really destroy that man? Could he tear down the empire his father built, the empire Carl himself was raised to inherit and protect? Then he thought of Aisha's collarbone, purple and swollen beneath a silk scarf, and the answer arrived without hesitation. Yes, whatever it cost him. Yes, he remembered, unbidden, a conversation from just hours earlier, when he'd asked Aisha directly whether she wanted him to go through with this, whether some part of her wanted him to simply walk away from the family entirely and start somewhere new, far from all of it. "Don't choose me over your family," she'd told him, surprising him with the answer. "That's not what I want. I don't want to be the reason you destroy everything you grew up believing in." "You're not the reason," he'd said. "He is. He's always been the reason. You just finally showed me what I refused to see." She'd taken his hand then, quiet for a long moment. "Whatever you decide to do it because it's right. Not because you're trying to prove something to me." Standing now in his father's study, with the deed's photographs saved securely on his phone, Carl understood exactly what she meant. This had never really been about choosing between his wife and his father. It was about finally seeing his father clearly, for the first time in his entire life, without the childhood reverence clouding the picture. But wait, because Carl wasn't the only one making moves that night. 2 floors above him, unbeknownst to Carl, one of his father's security cameras, hidden inside the study's antique clock, installed decades ago after a rival family once attempted to steal documents from that very safe, had captured every second of his search. By morning, his father knew exactly what his son had found. Comment where you're watching from, because things are about to escalate faster than you're ready for. Carl's father didn't confront him immediately. Men who'd survived decades in this world understood that rage announced too early only handed your enemy time to prepare. Instead, he moved with the same calculated precision that had built his empire in the first place. By 9 that morning, 3 of the family's shared business accounts had been frozen, officially due to a routine audit, unofficially because Carl's father controlled every signature required to unfreeze them. By noon, 2 senior captains who'd always been loyal to Carl personally received quiet visits from his father's closest allies, reminding them delicately of debts owed, of favors that could easily be called in, of consequences for choosing the wrong side of a conflict that hadn't even been declared yet. By evening, a rumor had begun spreading through the organization's upper ranks, whispered first in private meetings, then louder, more confident, more deliberately placed. The rumor claimed Aisha had manipulated her way into the family for financial gain, that she'd fabricated stories about abuse to turn Carl against his own father and seize control of the empire through her husband. It was a lie built with surgical precision, designed to exploit exactly the kind of doubt an organization like this would already harbor about an outsider bride. And it was working. If you're still with me, hit subscribe now, because the fallout of this rumor is about to change everything. By the time Carl learned about the rumor, half his father's captains had already started distancing themselves, suddenly unavailable for meetings, suddenly slow to return calls that used to come within minutes. Men who'd sworn loyalty to Carl personally now hesitated when his name came up in conversation, uncertain which side of this quiet war would ultimately survive. Carl found Aisha in their bedroom that night, staring at her phone, face pale, scrolling through messages from friends within the organization's social circle, repeating variations of the same poisonous story. "They're calling me a gold digger," she said quietly, not looking up. "A liar. Someone said I probably staged the bruises myself." Carl sat beside her, gently taking the phone from her hands and setting it face down on the nightstand. None of that is true, and everyone who matters will know that eventually. Will they? Because right now it doesn't feel like anyone believes me, except you. I have proof, Aisha. Real proof. Documents, testimonies, a recording of my father admitting everything to your face, days ago. Carl's voice hardened with a resolve that hadn't fully existed until this exact moment. My father thought spreading lies would isolate us before we could use it. He miscalculated. How? Carl looked at her steadily, something fierce and unshakable settling into his expression. Because he taught me everything I know about strategy, and I'm about to use every bit of it against him. That night, Carl began making calls of his own. Quiet, careful, methodical, reaching out to the handful of captains he trusted most, the ones who'd known him since childhood, who owed their positions to his own judgment rather than his father's fear tactics. One by one, he shared pieces of what he'd uncovered, enough to plant seeds of doubt without revealing his full hand too early. By the time he finally set his phone down near dawn, exhausted but resolved, he had exactly what he needed for the next move. A small circle of allies willing to help him gather the entire organization in one room, under the pretense of a routine family meeting his father would never suspect was actually a trap. Comment Part 2. If you're ready to see Carl's father walk directly into it, completely unaware his own son had already won. 3 days later, the summons went out across the organization. An emergency family meeting, called personally by Carl, framed as an attempt to resolve tension and demonstrate unity after weeks of unsettling rumors. Every senior member was expected to attend. Carl's father received the invitation with visible satisfaction, already certain his son was preparing to surrender, to apologize publicly, to reaffirm loyalty to the empire and the man who built it. He arrived that evening dressed in his finest suit, greeting captains with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He had no idea what waited for him inside that room. The meeting hall filled quickly, dozens of captains and senior members taking their seats around the long conference table, murmuring among themselves about the tension that had gripped the organization for weeks. Carl's father sat at the head of the table, exactly where he always sat, radiating the same effortless authority that had kept this room silent and obedient for decades. Carl entered last, Aisha beside him, chin lifted despite the whispers that followed her through the doorway. Several captains exchanged glances, remembering the rumors, wondering which version of tonight's meeting they were about to witness. Thank you all for coming, Carl began, voice steady, carrying easily across the silent room. I know the past few weeks have been difficult. Rumors, tension, questions about loyalty and truth within our own family. His father nodded slowly, folding his hands together with the satisfied patience of a man who believed he already knew exactly how this speech would end. So tonight, Carl continued, I thought it was time we finally addressed those questions directly, with facts, not rumors. He nodded toward the large screen mounted on the far wall, and the room's lights dimmed as the first image appeared. If you've been waiting for this moment since Batch 1, this is it. Hit subscribe now, because you do not want to look away for even a second. The screen filled with the original land deed, Aisha's father's true, unforged signature clearly visible, dated years before the version Carl's father had used to justify seizing everything her family owned. A murmur rippled through the room. This is the real deed, Carl said, voice hardening with every word. Found in a safe in my father's private study. The version he's used for over a decade to justify claiming that land was forged. I have the documentation proving exactly who forged it, and exactly how much he paid to make it disappear from public record. His father's composed expression cracked for the first time, fury flickering beneath the surface. Carl, this is not the place. It's exactly the place, Carl cut in, his voice rising for the first time all evening. Because every person in this room has spent years serving a man who built his empire on stolen land, forged documents, and violence against a family who never had the power to fight back. The next image appeared. Hospital records, dates and injuries, lining up with sickening precision, alongside the timeline of the land dispute. Then came financial records showing bribery payments to officials, followed by a photograph of the bruises Carl's own wife had carried into their wedding just weeks ago. But wait, because the next thing on that screen was something nobody in the room expected, including Carl's father himself. An audio recording began to play, the sound quality slightly muffled but unmistakably clear. Carl's father's own voice, captured that night in the study through a recording device Aisha had worn hidden beneath her wedding dress, admitting everything directly to her face. The forged papers, the years of silencing, the explicit threat against her mother. The room went completely, deathly silent. Every captain seated at that table had spent their entire careers believing loyalty to this man meant honor, meant strength, meant protection. Watching his own recorded voice confirm every accusation Carl had just presented, something shifted permanently in the collective understanding of the room. They hadn't been serving a powerful protector all these years. They'd been serving a monster who hid it well. Comment where you're watching from, because what happens next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Carl's father rose from his chair so fast it toppled backward, face contorted with a rage none of them had ever witnessed from him before. You would betray your own blood over this? Over land? Over a woman who wasn't even born into this family? I would betray you, Carl said, voice deadly calm despite the storm behind his eyes. Over every broken bone you gave her. Over every lie you told me my entire life about what strength actually means. I built everything you have. His father screamed, spittle flying, all pretense of composure finally abandoned. This empire, this power, everything you're standing here so proud to destroy, I built with my own two hands. Carl didn't flinch. No, you built it with fear. I'll build mine with loyalty. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in a movement too fast for most of the room to fully process, Carl's father reached beneath his jacket and pulled out a handgun, aiming it directly at Aisha, with hands shaking from fury rather than hesitation. Screams erupted around the table. Chairs scraped back violently as captains scrambled away from the line of fire. Carl moved without thinking, stepping directly in front of his wife, putting his own body between her and the barrel of his father's gun. If you thought this story couldn't get any more intense, comment part 2 right now, because we are not done yet. Put it down, Carl said, voice steady, despite his heart pounding against his ribs. It's over. Everyone in this room has already seen the truth. Killing us won't erase any of it. Behind him, he felt Aisha's hand grip the back of his jacket, not pulling him away, just holding on, as if her touch alone could keep him standing between her and the gun. He could hear her breathing, ragged and terrified, and he understood in that moment that whatever happened next, he would not let this be the way her story ended. His father's hands trembled, gun still raised, eyes wild with the desperate fury of a man watching everything he'd built collapse in real time. For a long, unbearable moment, nobody in the room breathed. Move, his father snarled at him. This isn't your fight to die in, Carl. Step aside and let me finish what I started with her family years ago. It became my fight the moment you put your hands on my wife, Carl answered, unmoving. It became my fight the moment I understood everything you actually are. Then slowly, one of the senior captains, a man who'd served Carl's father loyally for over 15 years, stood up and spoke the words that finally broke the standoff. Put the gun down, he said quietly. We won't follow an order to hurt them, not anymore. One by one, the other captains echoed the sentiment, some standing, some simply shaking their heads in refusal, the collective weight of an entire organization withdrawing its loyalty all at once. Carl's father looked around the room, searching desperately for even one face still willing to follow him, and found nothing but silence and averted eyes. For the first time in his entire life, he was completely, utterly alone. The gun slipped from his fingers and clattered against the polished floor. Within minutes, officials arrived, men who had taken bribes from Carl's father for years, who now scrambled to distance themselves from a scandal too large and too public to bury quietly anymore. They placed him in handcuffs themselves, eager to demonstrate loyalty to whatever power would replace him, now that the old order had visibly, irreversibly collapsed. As they led him out of the building, past captains who refused to meet his eyes, past the son he'd raised to inherit everything he'd built, he turned back one final time. You'll regret this, he said, voice hoarse, stripped finally of all its power. Everything falls apart without me holding it together. Carl looked at his father for a long moment, Aisha's hand held tightly in his own, and felt nothing but a quiet, exhausted grief, where rage used to live. No, he said softly. It finally gets the chance to be built right. The doors closed behind his father for what everyone in that room understood would be the last time. 6 months passed before the trial finally concluded. Carl's father was convicted on charges of fraud, forgery, extortion, and assault. Evidence so thorough and overwhelming that even his most expensive lawyers couldn't find a way around it. The empire he'd spent decades building didn't collapse the way he'd warned Carl it would. It transformed instead. Carl took over leadership of the organization with a very different vision than the one he'd been raised on. Under his direction, illegal operations were slowly dismantled and replaced with legitimate business ventures. Shipping routes that actually paid fair wages. Real estate developments that didn't involve stolen land or forged signatures. A reputation rebuilt from the ground up on something other than fear. The stolen land was the very first thing he returned, filing the paperwork himself the same week the trial ended, watching Aisha's mother's hands shake as she held the legal deed to property that had haunted her family for over a decade. "I don't know what to do with it," her mother admitted quietly, standing on soil that had once belonged to her own parents, soil that had cost her daughter 3 years of her life and countless nights of terror. "It doesn't feel real yet." "You don't have to decide today," Aisha told her, arm wrapped tightly around her mother's shoulders. "You have time now. That's the whole point." But as it turned out, Aisha and Carl already had ideas of their own for that land. Ideas that had nothing to do with luxury estates or private compounds. Instead of building another symbol of wealth and power on ground soaked in so much pain, they built something entirely different. A school opened first, serving children from families who'd never been able to afford proper education. Then a small clinic, staffed with doctors who treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. Then modest, affordable housing for families displaced by the very organization that had once stolen this land in the first place. If you've made it this far in the story, comment where you're watching from, because this ending is going to hit differently than you expect. On the 1-year anniversary of the wedding that had started everything, Aisha visited her parents' graves for the first time since the trial ended. Carl walking quietly beside her, carrying flowers she'd chosen that morning, without saying much of anything at all. She knelt at the headstones, fingers tracing the carved names of the father who'd refused to hand over his family's legacy even under threat. The mother, who'd stood beside him through years of terror, rather than abandon what they'd built together. "You gave up everything so I could live," she whispered, voice thick with emotion she'd held back for over a year. "I finally have a home again, a real one, not because someone gave it to me, but because we built it back, piece by piece, exactly the way you would have wanted." Carl knelt beside her, placing the flowers gently against the base of the headstones, his own throat tight with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel this strongly for two people he'd never actually met. "From today," he said quietly, "they're my parents too." Aisha looked at him, tears finally spilling over after months of holding herself together through trials, testimonies, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding an entire organization from its foundation up. He wrapped his arms around her, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just knelt together in the quiet cemetery, surrounded by the legacy they'd finally reclaimed. It should have been the end of the story. A clean resolution, justice served, land returned, love strengthened through fire rather than broken by it. But some stories don't end quite that neatly. Comment part 2 right now if you want to know what happened next, because trust me, you are not ready for this twist. 3 weeks after visiting the graves, a package arrived at the estate with no return address, wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed specifically to Aisha rather than Carl. She almost didn't open it, still cautious after everything her father-in-law's associates had put her through. But something about the handwriting felt oddly familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. Inside was a single photograph and a short, typed letter with no signature. The photograph showed her mother, decades younger, standing beside a man Aisha had never seen before in her life. Not her father, not anyone from the family photographs she'd grown up with, but someone whose features looked unsettlingly, unmistakably similar to her own. The letter contained only a handful of lines. "Your mother never told you everything. The land dispute wasn't random. Carl's father wasn't the only person who wanted that property gone. Ask her about the man in the photograph before it's too late. He's still alive, and he's far more dangerous than the father-in-law you already destroyed." Aisha's hands went cold. She read the letter 3 more times, searching for some explanation that made sense. Some reason her mother would have kept an entire second secret buried beneath the one Aisha had already spent years uncovering. If you thought the story was over, think again, because we are just getting started on the real mystery. She found Carl in his office, going over paperwork for the clinic's expansion, and set the photograph and letter down in front of him without a word. He read it once, then again, his expression shifting from confusion to something far more serious. "Do you recognize him?" Carl asked quietly, studying the stranger's face in the photograph. "No," Aisha admitted, voice unsteady. "But he looks like me, Carl. He looks like he could be." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Carl already understood exactly what she was thinking, the possibility hanging heavy and unspoken between them. "We need to talk to your mother," Carl said finally, already reaching for his jacket. "Tonight. Whatever she's been hiding, we need the truth before whoever sent this decides to use it against us, the way my father used silence against your family for years." Aisha nodded, though something cold and uncertain had settled deep in her chest, a feeling she recognized all too well from the months before her wedding, when she'd first started sensing that something in her carefully controlled world was about to come apart at the seams. They drove to her mother's new home in silence, the photograph resting on Aisha's lap the entire way, that unfamiliar face staring back at her, with features that felt more familiar with every passing mile. When her mother opened the door and saw the photograph in Aisha's hands, her face went completely white, all color draining away in an instant. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, voice barely audible. "Someone sent it to me," Aisha said carefully, watching her mother's reaction with growing dread. "Mom, who is he?" Her mother's hand trembled as she reached for the doorframe to steady herself, and for a long, unbearable moment, she said absolutely nothing at all. Then, finally, she spoke 4 words that shattered everything Aisha thought she understood about her own past. "He's your real father." If you are enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because part 2 is going to answer everything. Who this man is, why he's suddenly resurfacing after all these years, and what he actually wants from the family fortune Carl and Aisha worked so hard to rebuild. Aisha stood frozen in the doorway, the photograph shaking in her hands, 100 questions crowding her mind all at once. The man she'd called her father her entire life, the one who'd sacrificed everything, who'd refused to sign over the land even under threat of violence, hadn't been her biological father at all. Which meant everything she thought she understood about the land dispute, about why Carl's father had targeted her family so specifically, about the entire foundation of the story that had brought her and Carl together in the first place, might not be the full truth after all. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aisha finally managed, voice breaking. "All these years, why didn't you say anything?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears, decades of buried secrets finally rising to the surface all at once. "Because telling you meant telling you why he left. And some truths, Aisha, are more dangerous than the lies that protect us from them." Carl stepped forward, steady as always, even in the middle of chaos neither of them had seen coming. "Then it's time to tell us anyway. Because someone out there already knows the truth. And they sent this to us for a reason." Her mother looked between them for a long moment, then finally, wearily, stepped aside to let them in. "Sit down," she said quietly. "This is going to take a while. And once I tell you, there's no going back to not knowing. Comment part 2 below if you want to see what secret has been buried for over 20 years, because this story is far from finished, and the truth about Aisha's real father is about to change absolutely everything.